I see some things never change. Still wearing the best you can afford? This is my future.
We're days away from closing a major deal with Strataflux Industries.
Some people build real futures. Others just keep fixing things.
Everything has already been approved. He wasn't here to close a deal. He was here to steal $180,000 from the scholarship fund. And the forged documents carried my name.
Nothing to say?
I could have ended his performance with one sentence. But if he knew who I was, he would run. So I said nothing.
Still a loser. My ex-wife mocked me at our school reunion, unaware I'd become a billionaire. Still a loser. Danica's voice carried across the room like she wanted every person in it to hear her. She looked me up and down, the plain shoes, the simple dark suit, and smiled the way she always did when she believed she'd already won. The man beside her wore an expensive watch and spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before. She called him her future. He claimed he was days away from closing a major deal with Strataflux Industries. I founded Strataflux. She had no idea that the man she brought here to humiliate me was carrying forged documents with my name on them, planning to steal $180,000 from our old school's scholarship fund. I said nothing. Not yet. If you're new here, hit subscribe before we go any further. Stories like this one come out every week and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The invitation had been sitting on my desk for 3 weeks before I finally picked it up. East Harbor High School Class Reunion 25th Anniversary. I had looked at it the same way I used to look at old equipment nobody wanted anymore, like something that belonged to a version of the world that had already moved on. My assistant assumed I would decline. Most people in my position would have. But I kept thinking about a phone call I had received 2 weeks earlier from the school's principal, who told me quietly that the Vocational Scholarship Fund, the same fund that had helped me buy my first set of proper tools when I was 17, was on the verge of being suspended due to budget shortfalls. She wasn't asking me for money. She was just letting me know in the way that people do when they've run out of places to turn. I told myself I was going back for the school. That was mostly true. The Chesapeake Foundry had been a working shipyard for most of the 20th century, the kind of place where men came in before sunrise and left after dark, where the air smelled like iron and salt water and effort. Someone had turned it into an event venue sometime in the last decade, preserving the exposed beams and rusted crane hooks and original steel floors, letting wealthy guests feel the texture of labor without actually having to do any. I had worked in buildings like this when I was starting out, not as a guest, but as the guy called in to fix whatever was failing in the mechanical room. I knew what the pipes behind the decorative panels actually did. I knew what it cost to keep the temperature stable in a space this size. That kind of knowledge doesn't go away. It just becomes something other people stop asking you about. I arrived early and alone. Maria had a board meeting with her medical foundation that was running long, and she had texted me 20 minutes before I left to say she would come as soon as she could. I told her to take her time. I drove myself in the same truck I used when I visited job sites, not because I was making a point, but because it was the most comfortable vehicle I owned, and I had never seen any reason to change that. The first person I recognized wasn't Danica. It was Rhea Donovan, standing near the far end of the bar with a glass of sparkling water and the same expression she used to wear in the school cafeteria when she was working something out in her head. Rhea and I had never been close in the way that people talk about in reunion speeches. We weren't the kind of friends who called each other, but we had spent enough lunches arguing about things nobody else cared about: how city contracts worked, why certain neighborhoods got certain resources, what it actually meant when a company said it was investing in a community, that I had always felt like she understood how I saw the world, even when she disagreed with me. She had gone on to study law, then moved into financial investigations. I had followed her career the way you follow someone whose instincts you respect from a distance. She spotted me before I reached her and looked at me directly. No wide, automatic smile, just steady eye contact. She said she had been hoping I would show up. I asked her why. She looked toward the entrance and said, "Because tonight might not be as straightforward as it looks." Before I could ask what she meant, someone across the room said my name in a voice I hadn't heard in 9 years. Danica had always known how to make an entrance, not by being loud, but by making sure the people around her were watching before she moved. She walked toward me with the kind of deliberate ease that takes years to practice, and the man beside her matched her pace exactly, which told me something about him before he said a word. He was wearing a suit that was expensive in the way that communicates seriousness rather than excess, and his posture was the posture of someone who had spent a long time learning how to look like the most credible person in any room. Danica looked me over the way she used to when she was deciding whether to be disappointed or just tired. She landed somewhere between the two, and then she smiled, and then she said it loud enough that the people nearest to us stopped their own conversations. She asked whether I was still crawling around in basement mechanical rooms, whether the shoes I was wearing were the best I could manage, whether I had finally admitted to myself that some people just weren't built for anything bigger than the space they started in. Each question landed with the precision of something she had been sharpening for a long time. I recognized the rhythm of it because I had lived inside it for years, the way she could make a conversation feel like a verdict. I said, "I'm still working with cooling systems." That was all I gave her. She seemed satisfied. Then she turned slightly to include the man beside her and told me his name was Gavin Reddick, that he was a technology investment advisor, and that he was in the final stages of closing a major partnership with Strataflux Industries to install a new energy system at East Harbor High School. She said it the way someone announces something they've been waiting to announce, like she had rehearsed exactly this moment. She also mentioned that she was leading the Alumni Association's organizing committee this year, and that she had worked with the school board to redirect a portion of the vocational scholarship fund into the project as a community investment. I kept my expression still. On the outside, I was a man hearing unremarkable news. On the inside, something had gone cold and precise. Strataflux had no partnership with Gavin Reddick. We had no active project at East Harbor High School. We had not authorized any use of our name, our technology, or our project codes in connection with any agreement involving that scholarship fund. I knew every major contract in our pipeline. I had approved every one of them personally. Whatever documents Gavin was carrying, they were not real. I asked Gavin what legal entity was backing the project. He answered without flinching a company name that sounded plausible, a reference to a confidentiality clause that made verification sound complicated, and then a smile that was almost sympathetic. He said he understood why someone in my position might have questions about how these things were structured. Danica laughed and told me I had always thought I was smarter than I actually was. I asked which operational director had signed off on the Strataflux side of the agreement. Gavin reached into the folder he was carrying and held up the first page of the document long enough for the people nearby to see the logo and the signature block, which I understood was the point. I leaned in slightly as if I was trying to read it, and I used my phone to photograph it before he pulled it back. He didn't notice. He was watching the room, not me. He gave me a name, and I recognized it immediately because that person had left our company nearly 2 years ago. I excused myself after a few minutes and walked back toward the bar. Rhea was still there. I told her what I had just heard. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting for confirmation of something they already knew, and then she told me she had been tracking Gavin Reddick for the better part of 8 months. He wasn't a fraud in the way most people imagine fraud, some desperate man running obvious cons. He was methodical. He chose small non-profit organizations, alumni associations, community foundations, places where the financial controls were loose and the decision-makers were motivated by trust rather than documentation. He would spend weeks building credibility with one person inside the organization, let that person advocate for the project on his behalf, and then structure the payment in a way that moved money before anyone thought to ask the right questions. He had done it before at least 3 times that Rhea could confirm, and he had never been caught because he always disappeared before the contract fully executed. This time Rhea said he had gone further than usual. He had spent months cultivating Danica, positioning her as the person who would champion the project from inside the Alumni Association. She wasn't just a contact, she was his cover. If anyone questioned the arrangement afterward, she would be the one holding the paperwork. Rhea had sent a formal written warning to the Alumni Committee 2 weeks earlier, asking them to pause the transaction until the partner could be verified. The warning had been received. It had not been acted on. I understood then why Rhea had been hoping I would show up. She didn't have enough to move on Gavin yet. What she had was a pattern and a theory, and months of work that could fall apart if he got spooked and walked out before she could document the actual transaction. She needed him to believe that nothing in this room posed a threat to him, which meant she needed me to stay invisible. I thought about what I could do instead. I could walk to the center of that room, say my name clearly, and watch every assumption Gavin had built collapse in real time. I could end the evening in 5 minutes. But the money Gavin was targeting wasn't Danica's money. It was $180,000 designated to pay for tools and tuition and bus fare for students who were already enrolled in vocational programs and already counting on it. If Gavin walked out tonight without enough evidence to hold him, those students would lose something they had already been promised, and the investigation would reset to 0. I told Rhea I would stay quiet. She nodded once the way she used to when we reached an agreement in the cafeteria, and then she looked back toward the room. I walked back toward the crowd and let Danica find me again. She had more things to say. I knew she would. The whole time I was listening to Gavin, the rhythm of his answers, the structure of his confidence, the places where he was smooth and the places where he chose to redirect. Every good con has a weak point. I was going to find it. Not because of Danica. Not for any reason that had to do with what she said when she walked out, or what she said tonight when she looked at my shoes and laughed in front of people we both used to know. I was going to find it because somewhere in this city, a 17-year-old who reminded me of exactly who I used to be was counting on that scholarship to show up when he needed it. I had been that kid. I knew what it felt like when the floor gave out. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not tonight. Danica found me again 20 minutes later, this time with a wider audience. She had a way of collecting people around her at events like this, not by asking them to gather, but by raising her voice just enough that staying nearby felt like a choice they were making for themselves. She was telling a story about our marriage, the kind of story that gets sharper each time it's told, because the person telling it has had years to sand down anything that made them look bad. She talked about the apartment we shared in the early years, the noise from my workshop keeping her up at night, the vacations she had given up because I was always saving money for something that never materialized. The way she told it, leaving me, was the first intelligent decision she had made in a decade. The people around her laughed in the way people do when they're not sure whether something is funny or just uncomfortable, that half-second delay before the sound comes out. Gavin stood slightly behind her, nodding along with the expression of a man who had heard this story before and found it charming every time. But every few minutes, his attention would shift briefly to the room, cataloging exits, clocking faces, measuring whether anyone was paying the wrong kind of attention. Most people at this party would have read it as confidence. I read it as calculation. He turned that attention on me when Danica mentioned the project again. She wanted the room to understand what Gavin was bringing to the table, what a real partnership with a company like Strataflux looked like, and what it said about the kind of man she had chosen to build her life with now. Gavin let her finish, and then he looked at me and said calmly, and without any particular edge, that he understood why someone in a technical role might find the arrangement confusing. He said some people were built to execute, and others were built to structure the deals that made execution possible, and that both roles had dignity. Then he smiled the way someone smiles when they know the point landed clean. I asked him again directly which operational director at Strataflux had signed the partnership agreement. He gave me the same name he had used earlier, the man who had left our company nearly 2 years ago and delivered it without hesitation, which told me he had researched the org chart carefully enough to find a gap and build around it. I asked about the project code on the agreement. He referenced a number I knew was assigned to a hospital installation in Delaware, nowhere near East Harbor, nothing to do with a school energy retrofit. He answered smoothly, redirecting toward the broader scope of the initiative before I could press further. Danica cut in to tell me I was embarrassing myself by asking questions I wasn't qualified to understand. She said I had always done that mistaken stubbornness for intelligence. The people around her had mostly gone quiet by now, caught between the entertainment value of the exchange and the growing sense that something else was happening underneath it. I didn't respond to Danica. I was still watching Gavin. He was good. That was the honest assessment. He was the kind of person who had spent enough time doing this that he no longer had to think about the mechanics, the misdirection, the credibility signals, the way he controlled the emotional temperature of every exchange. The forged documents weren't sloppily done. The name he had used, the project code he had borrowed, the payment structure routed through a private escrow account. These were not the choices of someone improvising. He had built a version of Strataflux's identity that was real enough to pass inspection from anyone who didn't have inside access, and he had placed Danica between himself and the institution so that if anything went wrong, she would absorb the first wave of it. What I didn't know yet was how far along the money actually was. Danica answered that question without being asked. She was still talking about the project, about her role in making it happen, about what it meant for the Alumni Association to finally do something significant for the school. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she mentioned that the full $180,000 from the Vocational Scholarship Fund had already been moved into the escrow account. She said it like it was an accomplishment. The transfer was complete on her end, and Gavin's team would finalize the disbursement first thing the following morning. I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with anger at Danica. The money was already in the account. Whatever Gavin was planning to do with it, he was one step closer than I had assumed. I stepped away from the group and sent a text to our general counsel with the photograph I had taken earlier of the document's signature block and project code. The response came back in under 4 minutes. The name Gavin had used had not been affiliated with Strataflux in any capacity for 22 months. The project code belonged to an active hospital contract in Delaware. The escrow account number on the document was registered to a shell company with a mailing address at a postal box rental facility in Northern Virginia. Our legal team flagged at least 3 other institutions that had been approached using similar documentation in the past 2 years. I was still reading the confirmation when the doors at the far end of the room opened. Maria walked in wearing a dark navy dress, still carrying her hospital badge, and a folder from the foundation meeting she had just left. She moved through the room the way she always did, without performing anything, just present, looking for me. Some of the guests recognized her from the initiative she had been leading to build pediatric cardiac units in community hospitals across the mid-Atlantic. She didn't notice the looks. She crossed the floor, found me near one of the old crane supports, and put her hand on my arm. She said she was sorry for being late. I told her she was right on time. She leaned in close and told me the strategic investment round had officially closed that evening. Strataflux had been valued at $8.6 billion. My ownership stake was now worth just over $3 billion. I hadn't been thinking about that number all night, but hearing it said quietly in that room, surrounded by people who had spent the last hour watching Danica explain why I would never amount to anything, made something settle in me. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the feeling of a long calculation finally resolving. A few feet away, a woman I vaguely recognized from senior year was staring at her phone with an expression that had shifted from curious to stunned. She was a financial journalist. Now I had seen her byline a few times over the years. She looked up from her screen, looked at me, looked back at her screen, and then read aloud the name of Strataflux's founder and controlling shareholder. My full name. In the middle of the room. The shift was immediate and total. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Danica, who had been holding court near the center of the floor, went still in a way I had never seen from her before. Not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of someone whose internal framework has just stopped working. She said it had to be a coincidence. She said there were probably other people with the same name. Rhea stepped forward, then not to create drama, but because she needed my identity confirmed on the record before she could proceed with what came next. She said she had met me twice during state-level technology procurement hearings over the past 3 years. She said it the way she said everything directly without invitation for argument. Maria looked at Danica and said without cruelty that I hadn't been working on cooling systems for other people's buildings for a long time. She said the technology I developed was now running in thousands of facilities across the country. She didn't say it to wound anyone. She said it because it was true, and because Danica had spent the last hour saying the opposite. Danica turned to Gavin. The look on her face was the beginning of a question she hadn't finished forming yet. Gavin didn't flinch. He acknowledged who I was without conceding anything. He said the arrangement had been structured through a division of Strataflux that operated with a degree of independence from the founding team plausible enough to slow down someone without inside knowledge. Then he looked at me and said with something close to respect that he hoped I wasn't going to make this into something it didn't need to be. He said a public confrontation over a community project would not serve Strataflux's brand well. It was a threat dressed as advice. He was betting I cared enough about the company's public image to back down. I took out my phone and read the confirmation from our legal team aloud to the room. The name on the agreement. The project code that belonged to Delaware. The shell company. The postal box in Northern Virginia. The 3 prior institutions. Each detail was simple and specific, and when laid end to end, there was no arrangement of words that could make them sound like anything other than what they were. Then I sent Rhea the full documentation and instructed our legal team to formally report the fraudulent use of Strataflux's name and begin the process of freezing any outgoing transfer from that escrow account. Danica had gone pale. She was still looking at Gavin sorting through the past several months for some version of events where she had not been used. The people who had been standing close to her had moved back in the quiet, unconscious way that people do when they realize they've been too near something that's about to get worse. Gavin looked at Danica and said with a coldness that made several people in the room go very still that she had been the one to push for an accelerated transfer timeline. He said the paperwork had been processed under her authority as committee chair. He said if there were questions about how the funds had been moved, those questions would need to start with whoever had signed the authorization. He said it like he was reading from a document he had prepared in advance, which I realized he probably had. Danica understood it in that moment. Not the full scope of what Gavin had built, but the specific thing that mattered most right now. She was not his partner in this. She had never been his partner. She had been the door he needed opened, and now that it was open, he was finished with her. The school's principal received a call on her cell phone. She stepped away from the group she was with and came back 2 minutes later, looking like someone had taken the floor out from under her. The look on her face told me what the call had been about before she said a word. Gavin had not waited until morning. He had initiated the transfer that afternoon before he ever arrived at this event. $180,000 split across multiple accounts in a sequence designed to make it difficult to trace quickly. The scholarship fund was empty. Students who had already been accepted into vocational programs for the spring semester would be notified within the week unless something changed. Gavin knew what the call was. He straightened his jacket and turned toward the exit. He didn't make it to the door. 2 members of the venue's security team were already positioned near the exit. Rhea had made that call quietly without announcement sometime in the last few minutes, while the rest of the room had been focused on the exchange near the crane support. Gavin slowed when he saw them, and for just a moment the composure he had maintained all evening showed its first real crack. It wasn't panic. It was the specific expression of a man recalibrating, measuring the distance between where he was and where he needed to be, and finding that the math no longer worked in his favor. Rhea told him that officers from the Maryland Office of Procurement Integrity would be arriving within the hour, and that he had the option of waiting cooperatively, or making the next several months of his life considerably more complicated. She said it without theater, without satisfaction, just the plain structure of the situation laid out so he could understand it. Gavin looked around the room once, then walked to a chair near the wall and sat down. He didn't say anything else. The performance was over. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt different from the silences earlier in the night. Before, when people had stopped talking, it was because something entertaining was happening. Now they were quiet because they were processing something real, and real things take longer to settle than entertainment does. I looked around at faces I had known 25 years ago. People who had laughed when Danica called me a loser. People who had nodded along while Gavin talked about deals that operated at a level most people didn't have exposure to, and I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. There was no satisfaction in it. There was just the room and what had happened in it, and what still needed to be done. Danica was standing near the center of the floor, not quite in any group, not quite alone. She looked smaller than she had at the beginning of the evening, not physically, but in the way that people look when the structure they built themselves inside of has come down. I had seen that look before in the early years of our marriage when something she had been certain about turned out to be wrong. Back then I used to go to her when she looked that way. It had taken me a long time to understand that the instinct to comfort someone is not the same as the instinct to protect them from consequences they created themselves. She came to me. She waited until the people nearest to us had moved away, and then she said my name in a register I hadn't heard from her in years. Not the performance voice, not the social voice, just her actual voice. She said she hadn't understood what Gavin was, that she had believed the project was real, that she had checked enough to satisfy herself that she had wanted it to be true, badly enough that she had stopped asking the questions that would have told her it wasn't. And then she said the thing she had actually come over to say. She needed me to tell the school board it had been a misunderstanding. She needed me to use whatever weight my name carried now to soften what was coming. She said she could not survive the public version of this. She said her career, her reputation, every relationship she had built over the last decade, all of it, would be gone. I listened to all of it. I let her finish. And then I noticed that at no point in the space of everything she had just said had she mentioned the students. Not once. Not the kids who had been accepted into vocational programs on the assumption that the scholarship money would be there. She had talked about her career. She had talked about her reputation. She had talked about what she could not survive. The students were not part of the calculation she was presenting to me, which meant they were not part of the calculation she had been making all along. Something that had been sitting unresolved in my chest all evening finally settled into clarity. When Danica left, she said I would spend my whole life fixing other people's problems and never build anything of my own. For a long time, longer than I would admit to anyone, I had carried that assessment around with me, the way you carry something heavy that you've convinced yourself you need. I had built Strataflux in part because of what she said, and in part in spite of it, and I had never been entirely honest with myself about which part was larger. The fact that I had shown up to this reunion at all was evidence of something I hadn't fully worked through yet, some remaining need to be seen by the person who had decided I wasn't worth looking at. Maria appeared beside me without making it obvious she had been watching from a distance. She didn't say anything about Danica. She just said quietly enough that only I could hear, "Don't let her decide who you are tonight. You already did that. Years ago." She was right. I had known she would be. I turned back to Danica and told her what I had decided. I told her that before the end of the evening, Strataflux would wire $180,000 directly to East Harbor High School's scholarship fund. Not as a loan, not as a partnership, but as a direct replacement for the money that had been taken. Every student who had been accepted into a program for the spring semester would receive their funding on schedule, and the principal would have written confirmation before she left the building tonight. Danica's expression shifted towards something that looked like relief, and she started to say something that sounded like gratitude. I kept going. I told her I would not be asking the school board to characterize what happened as a misunderstanding, because it wasn't one. Rhea had sent a written warning 2 weeks ago. Danica had received it. The decision to move forward anyway had been hers, made under her authority as committee chair, and the people responsible for overseeing the school's funds deserved to know that. She would need to resign from her position with the Alumni Association, give a full accounting to the board of how the transfer had been authorized, and cooperate completely with the investigation. Those weren't conditions I was imposing on her. They were simply what came next when you made the choices she had made. She said I was punishing her because of what happened between us. I told her I was doing the opposite. I was treating her the same way I would treat anyone in this situation, not worse because of our history, and not better either. If she wanted to understand what punishment from me looked like, she should consider that I had spent the last 3 hours standing in this room listening to her while holding information that could have ended her evening in the first 10 minutes. What I was offering her now was not punishment. It was the same thing I had always tried to give her even when she didn't want it from me, the truth stated without decoration. She didn't respond. She looked at me for a long moment and then looked away, and I understood that the conversation was finished. Rhea handled the rest of the evening with the same efficiency she had brought to everything else. When the officers arrived, Gavin's phone and documents were taken into evidence. The data recovered from his phone contained enough to identify victims at 2 additional institutions and freeze a portion of the transferred funds before they completed the routing sequence he had set up. It wouldn't recover everything immediately, but it was significantly more than Rhea had before tonight, and the case that had stalled for 8 months was now moving. Several weeks later, I came back to East Harbor with Maria on a Tuesday morning when the school was in session. The hallways smelled the same as they always had: industrial cleaner and old wood, and something that might have been the cafeteria starting lunch prep. I walked to the vocational wing and stood in the doorway of the shop room where I had spent most of my junior and senior years. The metal workbench along the back wall was the same one. Someone had painted over it at some point, but the dimensions were right, and the marks along the edge where the vise had been bolted were still visible if you knew where to look. Strataflux funded the construction of a new technical training center on the east side of the building, a full facility for energy systems, refrigeration technology, and environmental engineering, with equipment that reflected what the industry actually looked like now. I had one condition for the naming. The center would be called the Amos Breen Technical Center, after the man who had taught in this wing for over 2 decades, and who had told me more times than I could count not to be ashamed of knowing how to fix things that other people only knew how to complain about. His family came to the opening. His daughter told me he used to mention my name occasionally in the context of students he thought had understood something important. I didn't trust myself to say much in response to that, so I just thanked her and meant it. The scholarship fund was restructured with an independent oversight committee and a verification protocol that required third-party confirmation of any partner organization before funds could be committed. It wasn't a complicated system. It was just a process that took the decision out of any one person's hands so that no student's future would ever depend on whether one person was too proud to ask the right questions. Rhea helped design it in the 2 hours she had free between depositions. Danica submitted her resignation to the Alumni Association the week after the reunion. She gave a written statement to the school board that by all accounts did not attempt to minimize what she had done. I didn't read it. Whatever she was working through, she would have to work through it in her own time without me as a reference point for where she stood. That was not indifference. It was just the recognition that her accounting of herself was no longer something I had a stake in. On the morning of the center's dedication, after everyone had gone, I went back into the shop room alone. I took the old wrench out of my jacket pocket, the one that had belonged to Mr. Breen that I had kept on my desk at Strataflux for years, and I placed it in the display case built into the wall beside the door next to a small placard that read, "The value of your hands is not in how clean they look, but in what they are capable of building." I stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I heard Maria's footsteps in the hall, and I turned off the light and walked out to meet her. On the drive home, she asked me whether I felt like I had won something. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said that I had stopped losing the moment I stopped letting Danica's version of me be the one I measured myself against. I said I had known that for a long time in the abstract way that you can know something without it being fully real yet. But that night, standing in that room listening to her choosing what I chose, it had finally become real in a way it hadn't been before. The knowing and the feeling had arrived at the same place. Maria reached over and put her hand on mine, and I drove the rest of the way home in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. The question Danica had asked at the beginning of the evening had stopped being an insult sometime during the night. What it had become, instead, was a record of her understanding of the world fixed in place at the moment she decided I wasn't worth believing in. Everything I had built, chosen, and walked away from and returned to existed entirely outside the frame of that question. She had asked it, expecting it to land. Instead, it had only revealed how much distance there was between what she thought she knew and what was actually true. That distance was not something I needed her to acknowledge. It had always been there. Now I was sure enough of it to let it stand on its own. The real failure was never poverty working with your hands or starting from a basement.